I'll tell you what, real life is nothing like the movies. You know, when Pinocchio got swallowed by a whale, he was reunited with his father. But me, I just got severe burns from the whale's stomach acid. That'll teach me for getting my marine biology facts from a cartoon where a magical island turns naughty boys into freaky donkey-human wooden puppet hybrids. Fool me once.
What a predicament!
Welcome to What a Predicament, coming to you from the belly of a whale. My name's Alex, and in the course of doing a previous episode of my podcast in the South Pacific Ocean, I went and got myself swallowed by a whale. And at first I actually naively thought that maybe being the only podcast produced inside of the world's largest mammal might be a good marketing tool, but it hasn't actually translated into any kind of listenership numbers. You know, maybe that's a predicament I could investigate in a future podcast, the futility of marketing a podcast from inside of a whale. Because that's what a predicament is. My particular predicament has made me sympathetic to the predicaments faced by humankind around the world, not just within the ecosystem of this particular enormous stomach. So each week, I pick a predicament and peer into it. And this week, we're talking yes, censorship. Now, there are a few aspects of the censorship predicament, but this episode is going to focus on censorship as defined by Wiktionary.org as the use of state or group power to control freedom of expression or press, such as passing laws to prevent media from being published or propagated. Today, I'm going to do nothing less than try and figure out who's really controlling the media, the hunt for the proverbial man. Is there ever a time and place for censorship, the greater good? Or is the regulation of speech the Orwellian conspiracy come true? Throughout history, different groups of people have been accused of controlling the media, like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, but seeing as groups like the Illuminati and such tend to be hard to get a hold of, I thought I'd start my inquiries with the media itself. I reached out to none other than the most listened to radio station in my home country of New Zealand, News Talk ZB, to turn the hard-hitting questions back on the news itself.
Hi, my name's Leslie Deverell. I'm the news editor at News Talk ZB, and I've been in the position for about 8 years now.
So, Leslie, would it be fair to say you control the media?
No, I don't control the media, but I like to think that I have a bit of an influence on the stories that News Talk ZB covers, and I like to think that I help us delve into those stories. It's something that you have to think about very carefully. We have to prioritise every day what stories we do and what stories we don't, simply because we don't have the resource to do every single story. And then we have to make the decisions about how much time we spend on each story. So we're making those decisions hourly, almost minute by minute. I don't make them entirely by myself. I have a team of senior journalists, and we discuss stories and decide what we're going to do with them.
So is there ever someone the word come from upstairs saying, oh, you're not running that?
Absolutely not. That's one of the things that I and previous editors before me, and I'm sure editors after me, preserve and guard absolutely is no editorial interference from anybody, from an advertiser, from a chief executive. It just doesn't happen.
So in a general sense, not limited to News Talk ZB, but what other obstacles you see in this day and age that stand in the way of fair and balanced reporting?
One of the issues that everybody in the media is grappling with at the moment is the demand from consumers that's been created by Facebook, by Twitter, by all those digital platforms out there. The demand for something instantly, and then people move on. So, and sometimes the demand is for the quirky, for the humorous, and we like to give people those kinds of stories too because they are important. But at the same time, sometimes the important things can get buried because they take longer, they take more resource, they take greater effort. And at the end of the day, if 30,000 people are clicking on a humorous story or an entertainment story and only 10,000 are clicking on a huge political scandal or something, there is a commercial reality there that sometimes does play a part in the amount of time put on stories.
So what would be the time and the place for someone like you to step in and censor a story?
We are sometimes a little careful in the language we use. Language has loosened up a great deal over the decades, and we now use words on air that perhaps we wouldn't have, like bullshit. That if somebody says that, we don't censor it out, whereas a decade or 2 decades ago we might have. There are some graphic details in some crime stories that we have that sometimes we think, we can paraphrase that. We don't need to give the exact detail of that. If people want the detail, maybe they can go and find it on a website or somewhere like that. But we're not going to serve it up to them over their breakfast cereal, over the radio, when they don't know it's coming. There are some times when, in order to get a story across, you do have to tell the most awful things. But again, we think carefully about it before we do. It's like the beheadings by ISIS. There is no need to actually show it. You can tell it. Or and you don't have to give every single gruesome detail to get the gravity of that across to people. So, yes, there are times when I don't like the word censorship because I don't like to think that we do that, but sometimes we do paraphrase in order to protect some people who might be upset by those very graphic details.
I know there's a sort of philosophy about reporting suicides and stuff as well, where there was some idea about not necessarily saying the cause of death because it puts it into the public consciousness. Is that?
That's the law, that we are not allowed to report some details of suicides. We're not allowed to call a death a suicide until it's been deemed that by a coroner, for a whole lot of reasons. And some of that is protection of the families who are involved in these things. So we are governed by laws as well, especially when it comes to court cases and suppression of some details in court. And suicides is one of those areas. We've also been asked whenever talking about suicides to make sure there are readily available details of people who are thinking of suicidal thoughts where they can go for help. People
have talked about, say, for instance, this is not as applicable, thankfully, in New Zealand, but when you get these say, mass shooters in the US and stuff, people have said perhaps the news and stuff shouldn't be, say, printing the manifestos of these people and turning them into sort of cult figures versus spilling the complete truth and saying who did it and that sort of thing. What do you think about the ethics around those sort of issues?
We do talk about those sort of issues a lot. We do try not to glorify acts like that. We do tend to just paraphrase or make vague references to the types of things those people were writing and thinking about. It is a difficult one because you want to get the issue out there. You don't want to... I guess the argument is by publishing it, are you encouraging others to do the same? But again, you can't not publish, can you? You can't just let terrible things happen and not say this is a terrible thing. We should be doing something to stop it.
It is a dangerous rabbit hole.
Exactly.
And what do you say to conspiracy theorists who think there's sort of a media agenda that they're trying to, control the population through fear and through this or that? Is there any validity?
Absolutely none from my point of view. I can't speak for any other news editor or news organisation, but as I say, we concentrate on telling the news. We try to be factual. We try to find different points of view. We try to find what's going on behind the surface, if you like. Yes, we do get PR organisations who flood us with media releases about all sorts of things. And all our journalists know that you just don't take something like that on face value, and you should never just write something from a media release. You need to make a few inquiries and try and suss out just, whether the information there is kosher or whether it's just slightly skewed.
What is the sort of organisation or body that governs news in terms of, is it a broadcasting standards authority, or who is it that is responsible for overseeing sort of fairness in news?
There is the Broadcasting Standards Authority, there's the Press Council, there's the Media Freedom Committee, but probably the best control of news comes from the consumers. They're the ones who can complain to these organisations, or they're the ones that can turn off the radio or stop reading the newspaper or stop watching TV news if they don't like what they're getting.
So finally, if a listener wanted to ensure that they were getting a balanced, fair, true journalism without spin, what would you encourage them to do in order to make sure they're as well informed as possible?
I'd encourage them to listen, read, and watch all forms of media. Yes, we really try hard not to have any bias at all. One of the instructions to all our journalists, if you speak to somebody on an issue, always go and find somebody who might have an opposite point of view or a different point of view. It doesn't have to be opposite. But again, sometimes you can't find the right person. Sometimes you're trying to find somebody and run out of time, and the story isn't then passed on to someone else to pick up. And again, there may be 20 different points of view on the one subject. So while we try to cover all points of view, sometimes that's just not possible.
Perhaps the conspiracy runs deeper than the news. The business model of media outlets, from the local newspaper to the big networks that are part of large multinational corporations, is all based on generating and securing an audience to then sell on to advertisers. And while they may have their own remit, like delivering the public service of the news, they exist to be profitable. And it's fun to sit around and say, "Oh, it's the media, man, they want you to think such and such," but when you peer behind the curtain in most cases, and I'd say actually especially with the major networks, it seems like there's no master plan, no ulterior motive. They don't really seem to care what gets the audiences as long as they're getting the audiences. They put out content that attracts an audience so they can turn around to an advertiser and say, "Here, we have X amount of people, give us this much money and we'll send your message out to them." And for more on advertising, you can actually go back to the very first episode of this podcast called Why Ads Suck. I'm thinking that explains why so many news outlets have gone all tabloidy or clickbaity. It's just for that reason. They're looking at the numbers. They've looked across social media and Facebook and seen, oh, look, this many articles about The Bachelor are getting the most shares on Facebook. Therefore, how about we put our own Bachelor articles out? It's not really part of any conspiracy or agenda to sort of keep the people down by the power of dating reality TV shows. It's just pure numbers, because that's what the shareholders understand and want to see. As Leslie said, unfortunately, it does involve a little bit more work for the viewer or listener, who will sort of has to seek out multiple sources of their media in order to get information and make sure you're not really getting a bias from one source. And there is a particular danger now with the internet and social media. We kind of curate our own programming more than ever. You don't just sit down in front of the TV, you're picking and choosing from different networks what you want to see, or from YouTube. It's really rewarding, I know, to just listen to the things that you agree with, but like any aspect of life, if you stop challenging yourself in that way, you get lazy and stale. It's like never working out or something, which I know all too well about never working out. So if Leslie Deverell isn't the one who controls the media, the question still remains, who does? Leslie told me that even the news, the great fourth estate, is still accountable to New Zealand law. So it occurred to me that the people who really control the media might be not just the lawmakers, but the people responsible for enforcing those laws. The Censorship Office is the government body in New Zealand responsible for classifying publications that may need to be restricted or banned in New Zealand. Henry Talbot, an advisor at the Information Unit of the Office of Film and Literature Classification, broke down for me just how the government controls the media. Man.
So the role of the office is to classify publications that might need to be restricted or banned. So basically, a publication it's a broad variety of things that come under there. Mostly, what we deal with are films, DVDs, TV shows that are on DVD or online, and video games. But yeah, it basically lots of other stuff can actually be classified, like billboards, clothing, books, magazines, things like that. So the idea is that we are by classifying these things, we're protecting the public good from the harm of certain publications if they were made available. So that might be because of, violence in films and games, for example.
Yeah, that's sort of getting into my question. Why is it important to control this aspect of the media versus a sort of free-for-all, anything-goes approach?
Well, I think the reason the law was passed really is because I think it's probably fair to say that when people are exposed to media, that can have an effect on their attitudes and way of seeing the world. It can also, maybe upset and shock them if they, particularly for young people. So our role is to help ensure that people aren't exposed to this if it might be harmful to their development. Our research backs up the idea that exposure to content in films, games, and other things can have negative impacts if people aren't ready for it.
So could you tell me about the decision-making process? Who sort of decides what makes the cut?
So we've got classification officers. There's a few people employed here that they go through the classification criteria that's laid out in the Classification Act, the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act. So that's set out in legislation. The criteria mostly deals with sex, horror, crime, cruelty and violence and some other things. But there's always more than one person making a final decision. Particularly for more difficult decisions, there might be a number of people, including the chief censor and or the deputy chief censor, taking a look at something before a classification gets decided. Ultimately, the decisions are decisions of the office as a whole rather than just any one person.
And is there anyone you're accountable to? Like, what are the balances and checks that stops you becoming the sort of Stalin in the USSR, sort of revisionist history and controlling, the sort of flow of public information?
Putting it that way, first of all, we're accountable just as public servants, so we're accountable to Parliament and the wider public in terms of, how we're spending taxpayer money, that kind of thing. For our actual decisions, basically, I wouldn't say we're kind of Stalinist. There are checks. If anyone's unhappy with our decision, those decisions can be appealed. There's an appeal body above us. Ultimately, decisions can be appealed to the courts, and our decisions can be overturned in that way as well.
And what about the idea that you'd read about in the sort of Orwellian 1984 that when you regulate language, specifically in 1984, they had a thing where they sort of controlled language which stopped citizens being able to express certain ideas or even think certain thoughts because they didn't have the words or language to form these complex ideas. How does that factor into your decisions about what can and can't be controlled by you guys?
Well, I think the important thing looking there is that we're not trying to sort of control anyone's thinking or even the words that they're using. New Zealanders are guaranteed the right to freedom of expression under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and our whole law works under that framework of having to do as much as we can to preserve freedom of expression. And we can't be restricting something because of, for example, someone has a particular political view or a religious view or something like that. It's only really about these core criteria of sex, horror, crime, cruelty, and violence. So it's not about the expression of opinion. It's more about depictions, really, and how those things might influence people.
What about, there was a quote that was often misattributed to Mark Twain, and I don't think anyone actually knows where it came from. But there's a quote that I think applies to a few different things in life. He, or whoever it was, said, censorship is telling a man he can't have a steak because a baby can't chew it. What's the sort of thoughts on that from as far as you who works in the industry is sort of concerned?
Well, I'd imagine that kind of comment is about, full-on censorship where something's being withheld from, the public at large just because maybe it would be upsetting to young people. So, but that's why our classification system is good, because we do have those graded age classifications, and the kind of stuff that we do actually ban is like really, really high level kind of very, very unpleasant stuff, which I don't think most people would ever want to see, and they certainly don't want to encourage. So, yeah, I think we're letting people eat their steak, but we're just putting warning labels on things at the same time. Working within that Bill of Rights framework, we want as much content to be available to the New Zealand public as possible. So if we can possibly give something a restriction other than, outright banning it, then that's kind of where that's where we will head, and that's why we have the age restrictions there.
So would it be fair to say that you are the man?
That's an interesting question. I don't think we're the man, because again, it's that Bill of Rights framework. We're just having to ensure New Zealanders' rights to freedom of expression, including the right to offend and to be offended. And we're not trying to control or influence what anyone's thinking. So, I think I mentioned before, under our criteria, we can't restrict people's freedom to express points of view about political issues or that kind of thing. We're just talking about things like violent and sexual content and the negative effects those might have on young people, really. So I don't think we're the man. I don't think we're the man, and I'm not sure if I know if the man exists. I think if the man exists, the man is probably, in my personal opinion, probably a amalgam of lots of different kind of structures out there. Maybe something related to the media. I don't know if the man lives in government at all. I don't think we're the man, though.
Sounds like something the man would say. So, the trail in my search for the man has run cold. But before I give up and chalk up yet another victory for the man, I had one final idea I wanted to test. The way media organisations work, be it a newspaper or a website or television or the radio, and I'm going to be simplifying this a heck of a lot, is someone produces some content to be distributed, and they're producing that for their target audience or maybe for a client, but they don't schedule the television network. And the big dogs that decide what programs or content are going out each day, they don't actually physically load the file into the computer. At the end of the day, could the person who controls the media be the technician who had nothing necessarily to do with the making of the content, but whose job it is to load that file into the computer software that spits it out to air? Don't they really control what we see? I asked one such technician at NZME, the same network that runs the radio station News Talk ZB, amongst others, about my little theory.
My name's John King. They call me JK. I'm sort of what you might call a recording engineer tohunga. I got into the creative side of things, of recording, in 1983. I did a few other recording stuff like concerts and everything like that, but this was where we had the most fun, in making commercials and other bits and pieces.
JK, could you talk about how the loading process works? Once an ad or a piece of programming is made, how does it actually get broadcast and go out on air?
Basically, we recorded the stuff in a multi-track called Pro Tools, and we do compression and EQ and a bit of echo and whatever effects we might have in it. And once we got it to the sound and balance we like, we load it into another system, which is a digital storage system, and it's called NextGen. And then from NextGen, it is processed by other people, and they put them on the on-air numbers, and then gets played on air or scheduled actually by other people. But I just at the front end of it all.
So are you the final step in the process in terms of after it's been written and after it's been produced, the final step is the loading into NextGen?
Yes, the final step is of what you hear on air is what we produce and load into the system.
So in theory, could you load whatever you wanted? If you wanted to put a message out there in the public, you would be someone who had the ability to just go into the computer, put it so that file plays instead of whatever was perhaps supposed to.
Well, there are checks and balances in the system in that, no, I could not put anything on because there are people checking all the time. in that as soon as I record something, the salesperson gets an email and the schedulers get an email, and they all listen. So this is deliberately put in, and because of historical events where the wrong stuff has gone to air, and so we check everything.
So, would you say you are the man?
Well, no, I'm not the man. There are just so many people in the chain. The writers. I mean, it's a team effort, and you got to play part of the team.
Another dead end. It seems like the technicians answer to the media company, the media companies say they answer to the government, and the government bodies say they answer to the public. So perhaps, in a way, we are all the man. Oh. Thanks to Leslie Deverill, Henry Talbot and John King. Thanks to John Galliers for the amazing cover art, to Marissa Holder and to Carolina Simpson at NZME. The opening theme music for this podcast is a derivative of The Little Hotel of Horrors by Decamentarium, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0. This podcast is a What a Cat production. And you can exercise your right to free speech by emailing me at whatacatproductions@gmail.com. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future predicaments you'd like me to take on in an episode of the podcast, or if you just want to shower praise on me, whatacatproductions@gmail.com. You can find What a Predicament online at whatacat.co.nz, on iTunes and most other places good podcasts are found. Thank you for finding this and for listening, despite the heavy cold I have this week, which isn't that surprising because over the course of doing this podcast, I've been stranded in Antarctica, I've fallen down a crevasse, I've floated in the Antarctic frigid waters, I've been swallowed by a whale. In fact, that's
2 weeks now inside this whale. I'll update the tally. I've been carving into this blubbery wall. 2 weeks. Oh, that seems to have upset her. So, I seem to have been blown all the way to this random desert island. Luckily all my recording gear seems to be okay. I'll describe the island. It's like every cartoon you've ever seen of a guy with torn clothes on this island that you can sort of walk around in maybe 12 seconds. Think like the size of sort of an inner city Auckland or New York studio apartment. At least it's a lot warmer here than inside the whale. Man, it really must have had one powerful blowhole. Well, anyway, it looks like I'm stranded here for a while. Please check it back in next week for a whole new predicament.